Good morning.
Good morning.
How's it going? Happy spring-like day to everybody. I think I would like to start this press briefing saying that here on the council we are thinking of the 157 souls lost on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 and their family members and friends who are mourning during this very difficult time. Those on board came from 30 different countries, and many were employed by the United Nations. Closer to home, we are thinking of the family of Cedric Asiavugwa, a third-year Georgetown law student who was traveling home to Nairobi. There was a passenger on this flight. Also, my chief of staff, Roland Ikeloa, lost a very close friend in the crash, Professor Pius Adesani. We send our deepest condolences to all those who have been impacted by this terrible tragedy. Also, I'd like to say that here on the council, we're very busy. We have a lot going on. As you probably have heard, we are about to officially launch our racial equity and social justice work March 13th at 10 a.m. We will have a press conference at the Civic Building in downtown Silver Spring, and we'll be joined by County Executive Elridge, School Board President Shebra Evans, Montgomery College President Dr. Pollard, students and community advocates. This is going to be the kickoff of the community engagement portion of this work. So I invite all of you to come, and then that evening at 7:30 p.m. we will hold a forum, and that will be the beginning of the community engagement work. We have developed also a toolkit that will be available for anyone who would like to hold a conversation in their community, in their workplace, and then provide that feedback to us. That feedback will be also part of what we will consider when we begin to work on the draft of our legislation. And just for clarity, the Government Alliance of Racial Equity has defined racial equity as when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved. And that's what we are seeking with this very exciting work. So I invite all of you to join us. Also, as you heard, on Thursday, we announced an action plan for our early care and education initiative here in Montgomery County. It's been a long time since we have had a very specific and well-defined early childhood initiative. So I'm really excited and grateful that the framework that I developed is what we are basing this action plan on. Also very excited that the executive has announced an investment of $7 million, and can't wait for the budget when he gives us his budget on Friday to understand clearly where that money is going to be invested. But I think that's going to be really important. Also tracking some of the federal announcements regarding possible child care block grant funds that will be available, and see how we can take advantage of that kind of funding, and hope that it is sustainable as well, so that we can use it and it's not just a one-time thing. And of course, monitoring the Kerwin Commission and the work regarding that budget to see what we might be able to use as well. We want to be able to leverage as much funding as possible, and we'll be working through this action plan through that lens. Also, we are pleased that several bills have been introduced. As you have heard, Councilmember Evan Glass did introduce Bill 4-19, Montgomery County Pay Equity Act, and it's been sponsored by all council members. And there will be a public hearing on March 26th at 1:30 p.m. And the bill seeks to eliminate the county's ability to request salary information or pay stubs from potential hires, which is a major reason why wage inequity between women, men, and non-binary employees is seen. We know that in Maryland, women earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by their male counterparts, and for women of color, the gap is much worse. We know that Black women earn 69 cents, and Hispanic Latino women earn just 47 cents relative to white men. So this is going to be a very important piece of legislation for us. Also, Councilmember Jawando did introduce the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act. And this particular act ensures that when a police officer is involved in the death of an individual, investigations into that officer's conduct are independent, impartial, and transparent, and that the bill will also eliminate potential conflicts of interest and help improve the public's trust in law enforcement. There will be a Public Safety Committee meeting on March 25th at 9:30 a.m. Another very important piece that we're working on right now has to do with the Veersmill Corridor Master Plan, and the Fed Committee has held several sessions on this plan. I'd like to point out that this is a very interesting and unique plan. It's the first one where we are going through it and considering our Vision Zero principles. It's also a plan where 75% of the residents are African American, Asian, or Hispanic. Over half of the local residents are foreign-born, compared to a third of the population countywide. The average household income within the plan is approximately $82,000, about 3/5 of the county's average of $133,500. So this plan, I think, does have all the ingredients of it being a template for many of the future plans that we're going to have to take up. I think that here on the council we have heard loud and clear from many communities that pedestrian safety is a challenge, that many communities have become more dense, and the infrastructure hasn't really kept up to facilitate basically the transit of cars as well as pedestrians, et cetera. So I think this plan will serve as that template, and I think the outreach and the way that communities have been engaged can really be an example of how to do future plans. I also want to acknowledge that the chair of the Fed Committee has worked very hard, and it's something that I feel very strongly about, in ensuring that we have no net loss of affordable housing. Right now, in this plan, we have considerable amount of existing market affordable housing, and what we are seeking and working with the owners and working with their land use attorneys is to be able to retain the same amount, but in this case, regulated affordable housing. And that's a huge difference, and I think it speaks to what we can do also in how we can set the tone for future development. So that is another area that we've been working on consistently. I will also share with you that on Thursday, March 14th at 10:30 a.m., the Audit Committee will begin to work on the briefing of the Office of Inspector General, the OLO report. And this is to go over what the Inspector General's report that we had received, which was a review of management control deficiencies contributing to the misappropriation of Montgomery County economic development funds. What that report showed, as well as what OLO has worked on, we will begin our work to determine what are those additional capacities that the council should recommend and that we should monitor in order to ensure further oversight. Some of the items that we will discuss is to evaluate the structure, funding and staffing in the offices of the IG and the internal audit, evaluating whether additional reporting requirements are necessary for the Office of the Internal Audit, and perhaps where should the internal audit functions reside, and whether threshold levels need to be adjusted for contract monitoring. Those are just some of the items, but I know that my colleagues on the GO committee, as well as Vice President Katz, who is a twofer, will have other areas to consider. And then I would say, of course, we look forward to Friday for the executive's transmittal of the operating budget. We know that this probably will be a somewhat tight year, so we are all very mindful of ensuring that we identify those priorities and work closely with the executive to make those a reality. Also, if people are interested in testifying, starting on March 15th, they can sign up online via the web page, or they can call 240-777-7803. And also, we are encouraging residents to use the hashtag MoCoBudget2020 to communicate views on the budget via social media. Finally, tonight, we will join a lot of people going to Annapolis to march for our schools. We are all advocating for equitable and adequate funding for all schools and students. We're advocating for more staff, including counselors and psychologists. We're advocating for expansion of career and technical education, universal pre-K, special education, and more funding for English language learners, and also community schools and support for families. And although Montgomery County obviously continues to place education as a very high priority, we also need to make sure that the state understands our challenges and helps us by giving us appropriate funding for all of those important priorities. So we will be going there this evening. And then I will also share with you that, since we don't have anything else to do, just kidding. Another piece that we're going to be looking at, of course, is our public campaign finance, the feedback sessions. And so we're starting on Tuesday, March 26th at 7:30. This will be a public forum on the county's campaign finance program. We know that during the program's inaugural election cycle, 68 candidates ran for either county executive or county council. Of the 38 candidates that filed an intent to use public campaign finance for one of these offices, 23 ultimately obtained public financing. Also, 2/3 of council members that won an elected office in 2018 chose public financing as the county executive. The county ultimately spent about $5.2 million during the 2018 election cycle. And of course, as you know, this was created by Bill 6-14, which I co-sponsored, and also it was my committee that worked through this process for this bill, including my amendment to create an independent advisory committee that would recommend the levels of funding. We've heard a lot of positive things about the program, but we've also heard a lot of challenges. And our goal is to receive as much feedback as possible and then begin to work on some amendments for the legislation if that is actually needed. So that is just a rundown of many of the things that we're working on currently. And with that, if you have any questions, I'll entertain those. Yes.
Regarding the budget process, I've heard the county executive give the figure of $80 million that has to be made up in the next budget. And then I know that the comptroller's office came out with some projections about shortfalls in terms of tax revenue for the state. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's going to factor in?
I think it would be premature for me to say anything, because we will find out on Friday exactly what it is that is contained and how the executive sought to make up that particular gap. Obviously, he needs to send a budget that is balanced, but he has not shared yet how he's going to achieve that. So we're all awaiting. I mean, we have asked, respectfully, if they can give us a heads up right before the announcement, just so that we can be at least a little bit prepared, but we haven't heard yet exactly how that will be. But he has been very open, I think, and very collaborative in terms of sharing information with us in terms of some of those challenges. If anything, I think it's also for us here, once we get the budget, to really understand that there may not be a lot of places where we can go to find money for the reconciliation list. So we need to take that into consideration, but I can't comment until Friday.
Could you talk a little bit about how the racial equity policy would be put in place and the kinds of issues it would be is meant to resolve?
Sure. So it's racial equity and social justice. That's the name of the policy. And what I decided to do was to be very deliberative, along with my colleagues, about this process, and not necessarily prescribe how it's going to be implemented, right? Because that will come out of the piece of legislation. I can just share with you that part of the impetus for me in terms of addressing this issue structurally, it's because I've been in public office now since 2004. And many of the disparities that inspired me to run for office remain. Some of them have gotten worse. And so between that time and this time, as you track the census, communities of color, low-income communities have grown quite a bit. You see it specifically in the school system. And so it is my view that until we start putting in place structural fixes, we will not be able to necessarily close these gaps just by reacting to it or trying to address it in a piecemeal fashion. And so that begins with the mandate of having to examine data anytime we want to propose initiatives or funding or land use decisions, we need to take a very good look at who are we affecting, what is the state of those communities, and how are our decisions going to address and eliminate disparities versus exacerbating them. And when you look at the issues of, for example, land use, I mean, they're huge. And part of this exercise is going to be also to engage park and planning leadership, the school system leadership, and Montgomery College leadership, for example, and to say to them, can you also look at your policies so that we can be aligned? Because the bottom line is that if they're also working towards the same goal, once their budget requests come to us, or let's say master plans come to us, we're going to be looking at it from that lens. And so it'd be great if we're all on the same page. But like this Veers Mill corridor master plan is a very good example of why it's so critical for us to have a policy that takes this into consideration. You look at who lives there, and decisions that we make could potentially displace a lot of people who are low income. Where are they going to go? So this is why I think this is really important. Once the legislation is adopted, and again, we will work very hard to include best practices and look at other jurisdictions, and then also the feedback that we've received, that will all go into the drafting of the legislation. But then it really, the real work begins then, because then it's about how are you implementing this particular policy. And that's why the executive is going to also play a very, very big role. And my goal is that it would be effective January 2020, and that gives the executive also, this year to set up capacity within his administration to implement that. And then here on the council, my goal is to appoint a committee that would perhaps meet quarterly to provide oversight and see how we're doing.
Who would you want the committee to be composed of?
I don't know yet. I can't. Maybe we rotate. Maybe we do something innovative. But I know every one of my colleagues is very interested in this issue, so we'll have to figure out. Yeah.
So last week, you all announced the Early Childhood Education Initiative, and I know you want to add 600 seats within the first year. Can you just give me a sense of, how you all are going to go about that? I mean, I know you all are looking for locations and working with providers. Just kind of walk me through the details of, how that's going to work within the first year and adding the 600 seats.
Sure. So 400 of those 600 seats, the goal is to recruit prospective family child care providers. The license provides for 8 slots. So if a person is able to obtain a family child care license from the state, and if you have, of course, the physical space for that, you can get 8 slots. And so the idea is that if we're able to recruit at least 50 prospective family child care providers in those geographic areas that were identified in the OLO report, and then we provide all the support to eliminate the barriers for those people to become licensed, then 50 times 8, that gives you 400 slots right off the bat. And it would be I think it'll be very doable if you do 25 providers down county and 25 providers up county minimum. You can get there. We might be able to do more. The rest of the slots were identified through Montgomery College has a program up county, an actual center, an early childhood center. The school system also has some slots that they can also accommodate, and so adding all of that, I think, just gives us right off the bat that opportunity. But then concurrently, what we seek to do is to look at where else can we find capacity and where else can we expand capacity. So if you have private centers that might have some additional slots, how can we use those? If you have community-based centers like Centronia, if they have additional slots, let's use those as well. But then also let's look at the expansion, whether it's commercial, sites that we can take a look at, or public facilities. I know my colleague Albornoz has talked about, in some of the recreation centers, there may be an opportunity to even use the modular units to then establish some early care and education centers. Let's look at interfaith, faith-based communities, intergenerational programs. So the idea is that we're identify existing slots, but then also potential slots that in year 2, we can then begin to scale, right? And so you do that scaling up every year thereafter. Interestingly, in this Ferris Mill Corridor master plan, there is one particular site on Bushy Drive, which is the Recreation Department facility that is slated for rezoning. And, we actually talked about then, the committee actually approved some commercial there that could potentially, I think, could also be used as a child care center. So we need to look at every opportunity we have to expand this. And it'll be multi-sector, it's not one thing. And I know there's been I think in social media, a lot of questions about, I didn't hear about centers, or I didn't hear about this, It's going to take all of the above because the need is very, very great.
How much staff do you think you would need for each center?
I don't know, that depends, right? The regulations come from the state. So you have to look at the size of the center, you have to look at the ratios. Those are very well determined and prescribed by the state regulations.
Okay. Are you good?
All right, thank you so much.